Today we're welcoming Dr. Nigel Brayer to the show today. I'm very excited about this episode. This information is very important to get out there. There's a lot of things that people aren't aware of, and I really feel that this guest here can bring this information to light. So I'm really excited to have you on the show today. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for this opportunity and just a good conversation.
Absolutely. Always good. I'm very curious. What is the story that kind of got you into the wellness place and serving people that's the way that you are?
Sure. So, to save a long dissertation, I'll kind of condense a little bit. Personal history. Anthony, before the show, you shared a little bit about your personal journey, which I super appreciate. And like yourself, is my kind of healthcare career started with personal problems, personal issues. I had a chronic knee condition that was initially thought to be cancerous, and I was a young man then in my late teens, early 20s, and I went through the whole process of traditional medicine. Years ago, at that time, I was accepted to go to University of British Columbia. I grew up in Canada. I now live in America, of course, but I was destined to go to medical school. But I had this severe chronic knee pain that really stopped me from being an active, athletic young guy to really being absolutely disabled. I could barely walk more than a few hundred feet just from extreme knee pain. And I went through the process of medical care, orthopedic care. I saw oncologists. They thought I had bone cancer. And it all came full circle over a few years where they determined there was nothing wrong with me, yet I couldn't walk or function. So,
Yeah.
and I know a lot of people out there, especially in my current practice of many years, is through the common system is people can be functionally, meaning they have all the parts and the pieces, but they just don't work. So my personal journey led me to more natural health care. So I had a kind of a large personal dilemma at that time. I'm like, well, the people that I thought had all the answers did all the tests, and I call them the Crystal Palace dwellers, is they live in this big crystal palace and have all the power of pharmacology and all the finances you could ever want. So we assume they have the answers. But interestingly enough, in my case, they didn't have the answers. And for so many, they didn't have the answers. So that kind of led me to question, well, I don't think that's the career path for me. And I pivoted, and then I initially became a chiropractor. And then that led me into functional medicine and acupuncture and a lot of, mind-based treatments and therapies. So long story short is today I presume we're going to talk about bladder issues and how it affects people and it affects women. But I find the parallels interesting because the same kind of journey I had many years ago that led me to my career is a similar journey that my wife's experience led me to discover and create what's called the Ironclad Bladder Program, which is helping people, women in particular, because it's a much higher prevalence in women, but men also, to help resolve incontinence-based issues. So again, as I was led through a process of experience to question I guess, the dogma, the system, and ask some pertinent questions, and that led me to finding the path, not only to help my wife, but also to help myself many years ago. So, kind of cool.
Awesome, man. Yeah. I find like so many people in the wellness space, they either get into it due to their own health issues or someone that they love. And it's definitely seen the story for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess from just a broader perspective, Anthony, it's like I would say that most of us in our lives, our experiences are leading us and teaching us and allowing us to evolve. Like back then and even currently in my life, things happen and they're frustrating and you're annoyed and you wonder why they happen. But from a spiritual perspective, is they're all helping to soften us and guide us. There's lessons to be learned. So that's certainly pertinent in my life anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, also it sounded like another thing is like the medical system is like, oh, you're fine, right? But then that's another thing we hear a lot, but it's always like we know our own bodies. Like nobody knows you better than you do. And just listening to that inner wisdom and taking the path towards healing, I always find is the best way because, doctors mean well, but, no one has all the answers for you. So just listening to that inner guidance, which it seems like you did as well.
Yeah, and what's really cool is I had a conversation with a patient the other day, and we were having this discussion in my office, and I told him, I said, imagine you had all of the wealth that you've accumulated in your entire life, whatever that means to you, and then you take all that wealth in your hands, and then you just give it to me. Say, Nigel, take care of all my wealth. You'd say, that's just a stupid thing to do, isn't it? Right? It's like, who better to manage, your life savings than you? Well, I flip that script a little bit and say, think of your health that way. Is most people come in and say, or not come in, but they just look at their doctor or they look at anybody and they say, manage my health. But what's interesting is I've had the privilege of meeting people all over the world from every walk of life, from the most wealthy to, absolutely no wealth at all. And what everyone has in common, besides they're human, is they all want to feel good and be healthy. I don't care how much money you've got, is they're looking for the same thing as the person who has nothing at all. So the reality of it is we all want the same thing. So the question becomes is how silly, and I guess it's probably conditioned, and that's a whole other question of society and everything else, but is why would you possibly give your greatest asset away to someone else to manage for you?
Definitely.
So so people say, well, doctor, you're smart, you went to school, you did years of training, and that's true. I learned a lot of specifics and I learned a lot of the inner workings. But Anthony, just like you probably know how to run your cell phone pretty efficiently, but you probably couldn't build it, right?
Right.
So your body's no different. Is you don't have to be able to know every intricacy of your body. That is my job, yes. But to be a really good user of a piece of technology, you just have to have some general understanding. So to be a human being and to live healthily, you don't have to like dedicate your whole life to learning and knowing physiology and anatomy and how it all works. That's what I've done. But you just have a general understanding. So that's part of the big thing, and that's what I hope our discussion gets to today, is having a general understanding of how you work is going to allow you to make so much better decisions. Just like if I was holding all of your wealth in my hands and I said, hey, this is how the stock market works. This is how investing works. This is how real estate works. I'm giving you understanding so you can say, I'm going to take my wealth and I'm going to put it into parts that seem right for me. And that's the same with the health, is I'm going to take my health bank or lack of health bank, and I'm going to start putting my energy into things that build up my health. And that's something that all of us get to do, but most of us unfortunately have passed it on to someone else and say, doctor, look after me. But Anthony, you're a great dude and I just met you, but you care about you more than I care about you, even though I
Yeah.
care about you, right? So like you said, is you're the best manager of you. You just need a little bit of tool and understanding.
I love that, man. Like our health is our number one asset, really. I mean, without it, it's really hard to do things. And like our doctor should be more of a coach. Like, of course, listen to their guidance. Ultimately, filter it through your own goals and your own values at the end of the day.
Absolutely true. And so I guess if the people listening get anything out of our discussion, it would be a little bit of encouragement to say, hey, it's really easy for us to pass the buck, but it's no skin off my back if you pass your health buck to someone else, but it's certainly skin off of your back. So, and we all have to live in our own health experience. And I choose health, so of course I'm very vested in this. And my enthusiasm is to kind of bring others into that enthusiasm because, I'm in my middle 50s and I want to live till I'm well over 100 and I want to function. I don't want just years of my life tick-tocking away because drugs can keep us alive and technology can keep our heart beating, but living is participating, it's being involved, it's enjoying life, right? So that's really what we're talking about here is being a contributor and being a part of and enjoying. So, and that takes effort and a little bit of time.
100%. So it sounds like we're focusing on the health span, right? Basically, not just living longer, but actually enjoying our life as we age.
Agreed. Yep. And that doesn't come from a med bottle. That comes from supporting the systems and and reducing what I call interference. And interference is interesting, is because um, For a patient, I like to break things down into three categories. Is everyone's heard this? It's kind of cliche. Is the stress is the cause of all disease, but that doesn't mean a lot to most people, right? Stress. Okay, well, what do I do? Do I get divorced? Do I get a new job? Do I, put my kids up for adoption? What happens, right? And that's extreme, but I'm just trying to get the point across. But to make it more succinct, there's three main causers of stress. There's physical stress, which is the stress of our body, our anatomy, the muscles, the bones, the ligaments, the nerves, all of it working together. That's a stressor, right? And the analogy I like to use is like a backpack. If I have a backpack and you sneak up behind me and you put a 5-pound weight in it, and tomorrow you put another 5-pound and another 5-pound, over a year I'm going to have hundreds of pounds on my back, but it's happened over time. But that sucks up energy. That's stress, right? Because we all have a finite amount of energy. And so that's sucking up physical energy. But then we also have nutritional, chemical, and hormonal stress. That's food. That's our endocrine system. That's the toxicities we're exposed to. That's drugs. That's pesticides. That's, things they spray in the air. All those different things are taking up chemical resources are. And then we also have mental stress. So why I break that down is if we can identify there's physical, there's nutritional, chemical, and there's mental and emotional stress, then we can start to look at saying, well, where's a place to start? Because if I just say stress is causing all your disease, well, that doesn't really give you any practical tools to start to become better. But if I can say, hey, let's look at your physical first. How's your body functioning? How's your frame? How's your spine? How's your nervous system? We start improving that physical stressor, then you start feeling a little bit better. 100% better? Maybe, but probably not. But that's going to improve, and that encourages people to look into the next step. Well, then let's look into your food. Let's look into your exposures, right? And as you do this, as you're removing these stressors, or I call them barriers, because if you think of our body like a plant, the plant doesn't need a whole lot, right? It needs sun, not too much, not too little, right? It needs air and soil and water. If you deprive it of any of those things or give it too much of any of those things, then it's going to be susceptible to problems. That could be disease, that could be inability to grow, all of the above. So our body's not a whole lot different. Is if we remove these things that take away its capacity to heal, then its capacity to manifest and heal dramatically improves. Now, I don't want to be so naive to say every problem that every person's ever had is going to disappear in a moment. That would be a little naive and silly, but it's all a process. And I know, Anthony, you shared a little bit about your Lyme story at the beginning, which I super appreciate, is you learned the process. And yeah, Lyme's may have had a bacterial issue that created a whole myriad of different things in your body, but you undid this process. And I don't know your full story, but by undoing that, you allowed your body to start to become its healthful self again. So, and that applies to, I would say, to all problems, even though all problems can't be resolved by what I just said, because the analogy I like to consider, it's like, hey, your car being low on oil started the engine on fire, but putting oil back in your car when the engine's on fire, you've missed the opportunity. It's too late. So you got to put the fire out first, right? And so the diseases are the same way. So if we think of it like cancer at end stage is you might have to go in and burn and radiate and chemically induce to try to kill off the fire, meaning the cancer overgrowth. But that's not what caused the problem. The cancer is a result of something that happened many years before. So does that make
Yeah,
sense?
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, just like you said, the body knows how to heal itself. But all we have to do is essentially get out of the way, right?
Take away what's obstructing that capacity. Absolutely.
Definitely. I mean, like you said, stress it's really like an all chronic disease, but it's so important to take care of. So one thing that you really specialize in is the bladder and health of the bladder. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So back to our initial discussion, Anthony, is I didn't have this dreaming desire to become a bladder expert. So, but the universe puts in place problems that I believe, or believes you can solve. And in my case, it was my wife. After the birth of our youngest child, who's now almost 8 years old, she started having incontinence-based issues. Now, I'm condensing it, for time's sake, but it didn't come out for many, many months. So what she initially did is she started avoiding things. She started avoiding travel. She started avoiding exercise routines, avoided a lot of things that could have been equated at the time to other problems like postpartum depression and things like that. But what ended up coming about many months later is she broke down and just said, hey, I've lost the capacity to hold my bladder, and I felt embarrassed and all the emotions that go with that, because we as humans think of bladder control as just a rite of passage, right? What's one of our first milestones when we're a child is we learn how to be potty trained, right? When we're 2 to 3 or 4 years old, whatever the age is. So there's a whole bunch of what's called subconscious baggage that we attach to this condition, right? Because you think to yourself, well, I can't hold my bladder, I leak, therefore there must be something inherently wrong with me. And so long story short is it put us on this path trying to discover, well, what's going on? And I did what most spouses would do, say, hey, let's go talk to your doctor, the gynecologist, to see what's wrong and get it fixed so that problem solved, everyone's happy, right? But we went through that process, and the gynecologist did the exam, and she said, there's nothing wrong. Everything's fine. All the anatomy's fine. We did ultrasounds, the whole schmear. And so she said, go to the physical therapist and have pelvic floor therapy, which for anyone experiencing incontinence, that's kind of the typical first step, where they go to the physical therapist, they do pelvic floor therapy, they work on strengthening the muscles and stretching the area in the groin and the pelvis. And we did that, or she did that, and she had very modest improvement, around 20% or so, maybe 30. And we went back to her, and the gynecologist said, well, I don't have a lot of other options, but we can try some medication. So they recommended a beta blocker, which, again, that's a heart medication, and it affects your blood vessels and your nervous system, which my wife didn't want to take. And then they recommended also could do Botox, which is a neurotoxin, to reduce tension in the nervous system or to numb or paralyze a nerve. Or they could recommend what's called sling procedure, where they do a surgery and they essentially, inside your body, they put a sling underneath to elevate the urethra. That means the tube out of your body, to lift it up. And none of those seem like valid options. At the time, my wife was in her early 40s, and we're like, well, the future's not looking that great when I don't have control of my bladder in my early 40s. What happens when I'm 50, 60, 70, 80 and above, right? So that led me on a path to saying, this just doesn't make sense to me, right? There's got to be a reason that this is happening. So I started doing some deep dive research into the anatomy and physiology of the bladder, the kidneys, the urethra, the ureters, and the pelvic bowl itself. And kind of where the big aha moment came, Anthony, is when I was researching what's called the innervation of the urinary sphincters, which means a sphincter is a valve. So if you think of the bladder as a balloon, and then you think of a straw coming out of the balloon, like you'd blow the balloon up, what a sphincter is imagine you pinching off where the straw and the balloon meet to keep the air from coming out. That's what a sphincter does, right? Is when I was looking at the nerve supply, which means innervation, of that clamping, the sphincter, what I found is super interesting is I found that 30% of that valve is consciously controlled. So for your listeners out there, is think of it like your bicep, your muscle of your arm, is when you contract your arm muscle, you're 100% using your brain to consciously control that muscle, right? But now imagine you only have 30% control of this. Well, that begs the question, what's the other 70? And this is what's so profound, is the other 70% of that valve is what's called autonomically controlled. So what that means is you and I are sitting here and your heart is beating. So let's say you get really excited about some topic, your heart rate's going to go up, your blood vessels are going to, constrict, and you're going to put more energy to certain parts of your body based upon your subconscious autonomic nervous system. You didn't have to think about it. You didn't have to tell it what to do. It just did it, right? Let's say you had 5 cups of coffee today and now your sympathetic is heightened. Your body's even more ramped up. That's autonomically controlled. So what it means is your bladder is 70% controlled by your responses to stress. So where does this all come about? So when I read that, I said, we're looking at the entirely wrong place. We're thinking bladder issues are bladder issues, and they're issues of the pelvic bowl because that's where babies came out, and that's where hormones are most influencing that area, right? The uterus and all the anatomy there. But the real issue, the bigger issue, is the subconscious mind and the autonomic nervous system. And what the autonomic nervous system is made up of is 2 different competing nervous systems. You've got the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight, flight, strive, protect. It's the part of our nervous system that keeps us from dying, right? To protecting ourselves, either real or imagined, it doesn't matter. It's there to protect us. And then you have your parasympathetic nervous system that's there to heal us and repair us. And what's interesting, and that's why so many women, and men too, of course, but so many people, once they've had a stressful event in their life, they start to experience incontinence. In my wife's case, it was childbirth and being a new mother. Okay? Others, it can be a physical trauma. It can be a car accident. It can be a divorce. It can be a loss of job. It doesn't matter, but those are usually milestone stressful events that shift the balance from they're doing okay and functional to they can't reach balance again. So what that led me to do is saying, hey, what in my wheelhouse or what in my toolbox do I have to start to affect the autonomic nervous system? And most importantly, to calm down the sympathetic nervous system. So that's what took me into more of my functional medicine training and my acupuncture training. And so I started looking into how can I influence the autonomic nervous system with the goal of restoring the bladder function. And so what I did over the next few years is I started working with my wife, and I started working with patients in my office, and I found that when I addressed those key issues in a certain protocol is 95% of the time, they all improved. Even the ones who had physical trauma. So I've had several patients who've had uterine or ovarian cancer. And what happens with those type of cancers is they'll usually remove the uterus, then they'll remove the ovaries, which causes a lot of scar tissue. Then they'll usually use radiation. And they'll radiate, which is, ionizing radiation to destroy tissue. So you're destroying tissues, you're destroying nerves, and in spite of the anatomy being disrupted, the protocol still has an impact because it's above and beyond just the anatomy. So it's pretty cool, just
Absolutely.
how it all intertwines and how the body can start to heal when you start balancing out that part of the nervous system.
Definitely. I mean, it sounds like for you it's like a process of asking questions, which kind of led you to the answers. Like you started to ask better questions, started to get better answers. And you come across like how the autonomic nervous system really plays a role in bladder. I didn't really know that. It's pretty interesting.
And what's interesting too is, so for folks listening to this, is they think, oh, I don't have a bladder issue. Let's disregard all this discussion. But what's interesting is almost all chronic diseases have a major component in the autonomic nervous system. So here's a case in point, is the number one cause of death in first world nations is heart disease. Heart disease is not a heart problem. We weren't all born genetically, deficient with bad hearts. But first world nations are chronically under stress. That chronic stress affects the heart and the blood vessels over many, many years. So chronic stress over many years affects blood vessels, it affects blood sugar, it affects inflammation, which affects the heart. And the heart is, like the bladder, The heart is the symptom, just like in most bladder issues, the bladder's the symptom, okay? But the solution isn't in finding better ways to do surgeries on the heart. The solution is finding better ways to manage how we manage our life and how we manage our stressors, which we broke down into the physical, nutritional, chemical, and mental and emotional, right? So I guess what I'm trying to help people understand is any disease process has, at least in part, its origin in how the autonomic nervous system's regulated, and that's based upon stress.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. I mean, I wouldn't think like stress would be like the cause for bladder issues, like it directly, but I mean, it definitely can be, obviously. I mean, I don't know if that's what a lot of people think about it. Am I right on that?
Yeah, so there's no denying that physical structure changes as we age. So I'll just use a male, female, it doesn't matter, but let's talk about females because we all know that the female hormone cycle is fluxing every month, right? And as hormones change, tissues change, okay? So let's, for a male example, is male's testosterone level when they're younger is much higher than when they're older. That's blatantly apparent when you look at a 25-year-old male and you look at a 50-year-old male, right? And so hormones change and they change tissue. That's established. But we're talking about the 30% right now. So stressful events, menopause, perimenopause, that's a change. Changes can challenge the body. Childbirth, that's a change. We see a lot of young women with incontinence because they're athletes. So they have physical stress from jumping and moving and sports, right? So those are challenges. There's no denying that. What we are looking at is what's the general tone. So I like to think of it like a line, okay? So if I'm right on this line, and let's say above the line is any symptom, you name it, whatever you want. We'll call it incontinence for now. So bladder leakage. So I do anything different. My hormones change a little bit. I anticipate going to the bathroom. I have a fight with my spouse or I had a tough day at work. Boom, I go just above this line. So I guess the answer to most of the problems we're talking about is how do I get down here and function in this line, this area? And that's, again, addressing the stressors, right? The goal isn't to just get people dry, which it's an important one. That's why people come to me. But the goal is to bring them down here so that they're functioning well below the threshold of where symptoms lie. And that comes from changing the autonomic nervous system. That comes from changing the inflammatory profile of your body. What's creating inflammation? What's creating oxidative or stress in your body? What's causing your body resistance, right? So we could be talking about heart disease right now too, but it's about drawing this down so that we're functioning in this balance process versus this imbalance.
Definitely.
Does that
And
make
like you
sense?
said, like disease is kind of a symptom, right? It's a symptom of our lifestyle. And in a sense, like a disease is kind of a miracle in a sense, because it's your body is trying to save your life, right? Like with certain diseases, like a tumor, right? It's trying to wall everything off and protect you, right? So it's kind of like a reframing. Like our body's not doing anything to hurt us; it's really trying to protect us in a sense.
Yeah, and agreed. And so, and it goes back to, again, societal and pharmaceutical, pushing agendas, all that other stuff is the mindset of most of us is our body is flawed and we have to unflaw it. We got to take something to make it better. We got to enhance it. But I encourage people to shift because that's, in my opinion or observation, is a wrong idea. Is our body's inherently healthy. We just have to remove those barriers. And what that little change in understanding does is that allows you, it empowers you. The one says, I have to seek for a savior. What's my savior? Oh, it's a new drug. It's a new creation. It's a new doctor. It's a new this. It's a new that. It's a buy. Let's do this. And the other is an empowerment of saying, how did I allow or set up the environment for this to happen? Then you start looking within instead of looking outside of yourself. Does that make
100%,
sense?
yeah. And it's not like to say everything is our fault, but it's our responsibility. Meaning, like, yeah, this happened. I may have not been aware of my choices, and I may have been aware of certain things that have been happening. But now that I know, I get to decide what happens next, and I get to write the story of my health. The pen is in my hands.
Agreed. So just that statement alone, Anthony, kind of helps people instead of being, and this goes deeper, is you are powerless as a victim, pure and simple. So here's an example, is I have this problem. Poor me, this problem happened to me, okay? That's an area of, there's no power in that. You're looking for somebody to save you, or you're just looking to live in your own experience and that's it. Versus, like you had just said, is most of us don't know how we created our problems. So it's not about guilt. It's not about saying, oh, I screwed up and there's something inherently wrong with me. That's kind of where like my job comes in, or someone who does what I do or similar, is not to say you screwed up and unscrew it. It's let's look at what's going on big picture. Let's look at some of the avenues, and I don't have any great insight. I just have a lot of questions, and I have some information that leads me, is as you start looking and you say, hey, well, let's look at some of my daily habits. How does this help or hurt me? Let's look at some of my daily thinking. How does this help or hurt me? Let's look at some of these past regrets and some of the angers and resentments I hold. How is this helping or hurting me? So what we do is when we start asking these questions and we say, hey, I had some hand in this, you now are empowered, because when you take responsibility, you now have some tools. Now, you don't have to have all the answers, because most answers aren't like a yes or no. They're the process of an answer. So just like I had a problem personally, and I was frustrated and overwhelmed, but things didn't make sense. And the fact that it didn't make sense, it led me, because of personal interest, to start asking questions, and that led me on a path of making sense. And then, oh, by the way, it led me on the path to resolve my personal issues. It's not a whole lot different than your story. Things just didn't make sense. You could say, I'm a victim of Lyme's, and the stats for Lyme's, chronic Lyme's, is not that good. So you said, hey, I don't want to just succumb to this victim mindset. I want to look. And if you look, and each step allows you to learn more, grow more, and to take away more of the resistance, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, the power of self-assessment is key.
Agreed. And so back to, again, what we talked about too, is culturally, we're so busy looking outside of ourselves. We're looking for distractions. We're comparing ourselves. We're looking for this, for that. In my opinion, all that is to keep us from doing what we really ought to do, which is just to sit quietly and be, and ask a couple questions and see what happens. But if we're constantly distracted, not only are we affecting our autonomic nervous system, which is going to make us sicker, right? Because our stressors, our comparisons, our constant busynesses, that adds more of that autonomic dysfunction, which adds more to our diseases. So I'm a big believer that most of the things that we distract ourselves with are actually contributing more than we think to our problems. And the biggest
100%.
one would be our phones and social media and all that other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I just made a decision. I just decided to get well. It was like internal conviction, and there was no other option. I just saw the sense of possibility and what could be. I'm like, let's go.
Yeah. And I'm grateful you're sharing that message, because I think a lot of people, especially when they have really chronic diseases, or if they've had issues for a very long time, and I see this with a lot of my patients, is they lose heart and they feel hopeless. And so when they hear a lot of these type of conversations, they'll say, oh, all right, well, Anthony's a young guy, and I get it. He was full of enthusiasm, and he was frustrated and overwhelmed, but he doesn't feel like I feel. He hasn't had 30 years of a condition. He hasn't had his whole life become this tiny little box because of it. And so I empathize with those people, because I can understand and feel, hey, yes, that mountain seems overwhelming. And I don't want to say, hey, it's so easy, just fix it, just do this and problem solved. It's not so simple. But what I'm trying to say is, if we just change a little bit of our mind script, no matter how big our disease is, and just say, hey, I don't have the answer, but I know that there is an answer. I don't know how it's going to come, but I'm going to trust that the next step will appear in front of me somewhere or somehow. That little opening is a step. And so, like, people ask me, they'll say, Doc, what's a practical thing I can do to help my bladder issue? Or what's a practical thing I can do for my chronic pain? And what I usually do, and no matter what the condition is, I say, start writing down everything you eat and drink and rate your day on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the best day of your life, whatever that means to you, and 0 meaning the worst day of your life, and start paying attention to what you put across your lips, food and drink, and how you feel. So at the end of the week, there would be a maximum score in my example of 70. That would be the best week of your entire life. But what that's doing is that's starting to become aware. Is when you can start to become aware, because remember what food is. Food is just chemicals. It's biochemistry. So there's proteins, there's carbohydrates, there's fats, there's micronutrients, there's vitamins, there's minerals, there's all these things, but that's what food is. Food isn't just, whatever you're eating. If you break it down, it is chemistry, biochemistry. Just like drugs are chemistry. Those are chemicals made in a lab versus chemicals made, by a plant or an animal or whatever it is. So when we start looking at the daily things we put in, we're looking at how chemistry affects our mood. And by that self-awareness, then we can start asking some simple questions. And the analogy, Anthony, I like to use is imagine I'm dead broke. I don't have a nickel to my name. And I come to you and I say, hey, Anthony, I'm broke. Can you help me get my finances figured out? I want to figure out why I'm so broke. And the very first thing I could imagine you would say would be saying, hey, Doc, where are you spending your money? And I would probably say, well, I don't know. And then you'd say, well, pay attention. So I want you to write down every dollar you spend every day for the next 7 days, and then let's meet up in a week and let's talk about it. And at the end of the week, you and I are going to sit down and you're going to look at it, and some things are just going to blast out into your face, right? Because you're observing. You're going to say, oh my gosh, Nigel, you're spending $9 on a cup of coffee every morning. Let's save $9 a day. Why don't you make some coffee at home? And let's start there. Did it solve all my problems? No, but it gave me back $9 a day. Times that by a week, you're making some money, right? And then what happens is when we observe things, things become a little more apparent. Now, if we look at food and we say, oh my gosh, I'm eating Skittles every day, which are full of, chemical toxins and colorants and neurotransmitter disruptors and hormone disruptors, just a whole myriad of things. Let's say I'm having a bag of Skittles every day. Well, that's a very simple first step for somebody who's in chronic pain or has, blood pressure issues or you name it, right? So what I'm saying is these little tiny pay attention steps that seem insignificant are the first step in life changing. And it starts with food and correlating with your mood. Oh my gosh, every morning I feel like I've been run over by a truck. How come? Well, could it be the ice cream that you ate yesterday? Maybe we have sensitivities to dairy. Could it be the gluten that we're consuming? Do you see how these questions lead you to ask more questions, and then they lead to some answers, and then they lead to other questions and other answers? So just like we get our problem bit by bit, we usually get our solution bit by bit also.
Absolutely. It's all about those small wins, man.
Agreed.
Yeah. Another thing you talk about is bladder training. So do you want to define that and how we can actually do that if we're having some incontinence?
Sure. So let's digress a tiny bit. So we talked about the bladder function is we've got 70% autonomic, we have 30% conscious skeletal control. So part of my protocol, the Ironclad Bladder Program, we do 3 things. We first start to retrain the autonomic nervous system. You're using what's called neurosomatic retraining, which I won't get deeply into that because it's a little bit of a process. The next is we use acupuncture techniques to help rebuild and reset the neural pathways between the brain and the bladder. Okay? And then part of our program is I developed it's an exercise, or we'll call it a protocol. It's called a squiggle. And what the squiggle does is it incorporates, because some people, as part of the 30%, have weakness of the detrusor muscle, which is the muscle that controls the balloon. Okay, think of the bladder as a balloon. And some have weakness of the sphincters, which are the valves that are pressing on the tube that goes outside of our body. Some people have weakness or too much tension or scar tissue of what's called the perineum, The perineum are like the muscles. If you reach up underneath your groin, there's a bunch of muscles. You feel the bones there. That would be the pubic bone. There's muscles that form a bowl that really hold everything of your body inside. In a male, you'd have your intestines and your bladder and everything else. In a female, you have your uterus and your ovaries and your bladder. Well, that's called the perineum, and those muscles can be traumatized and scarred. They can be weak from lack of use or from hormone changes. So what the squiggle is a squiggle is a technique where you stand with wide legs and you hold on to something like a countertop or a bench, and you squat down as low as comfortable so your knees don't bother you. And at the same time, you breathe out and you do what's called a kegel, is you squeeze like you're stopping yourself from going to the bathroom. So imagine everyone goes to the bathroom, you go to the bathroom and you stop the stream of flow. That's squeezing that sphincter, okay? That's called a kegel exercise. So what the squiggle is you open your legs wide, you squat down, you get a stretch of the perineum, you're breathing out, and your diaphragm of your lungs, so remember the diaphragm of your lungs is just below your rib cage and it attaches to the back of you and your spine. So as you breathe out, your diaphragm is moving up and it's pulling on the bowel, the small intestines, and it's creating a very small vacuum. That's called vasopressive activity. So it's pulling up on the bladder while you're pulling down on the perineum, and it's stretching and it's strengthening at the same time. So part of our protocol is doing what's called the squiggle. So that's helping to open space, it's tightening as well as stretching at the same time, which is pretty cool because, again, as a kegel itself, which is a very common physical therapy technique, is just squeezing. But remember, as many people who have weakness have also scarring and tension. So what we're doing in this technique is we're strengthening and we're stretching at the same time. So we're addressing the too tight and we're addressing the too weak together.
Got it. That makes sense. So it sounds like strengthening the area can help. I mean, it just sounds obvious, right? But a lot of people are like, how do we do it, right? And you kind of laid out a great protocol there.
Yeah. And so as part of, like I said, is the Ironclad Bladder Program, that's just 1/3 of what we talked about, okay? The other parts are addressing that neurosomatic and that disconnect from the nervous system. And it's laid out in a super simple way that's easy to follow so that the results are consistent. And that's pretty much why I did what we did, is not only did I help my wife and I help my patients in my practice, but one of the biggest barriers that people have with these problems is they don't talk to anybody about it. And like in my wife's case, is even if they do talk to somebody about it, their options are extremely limited. You've got drugs or you've got surgery, and neither of them are that effective, and neither of them really get to the source of the problem. So what I wanted to do, and why I put this program kind of out on the electronic world, is because you can do it at home and you can get amazing results. You don't need to, seeing me in my office is expensive. Going through treatment at my office is expensive. So doing it at home and being able to reduce the barriers of, hey, having tough conversations, not getting great options anyway, even if you had the conversations, and then reducing that barrier of having to spend a lot of money to get the results.
That's great. I mean, because like you're saying, we can do you can go to the office, but there's so many things we can do by ourselves, right? Just by learning and education. And it just comes back to what we were talking about in terms of empowerment. So,
and what's interesting, Anthony, is people say, well, Doc, I can find all this out on my own. And the answer is you absolutely can. So what happened when there was a big challenge is I went to the people I thought had the answers and they didn't. Then I started researching. But the research articles that I read, the anatomy and physiology textbooks and journals that I read, we all have access to. Okay, it's not like I have special access. I read the same stuff the urologists read. I read the same stuff the physical therapists read. But what happens is when we look at it from a different set of eyes, then answers start to happen. But what I did find is, yes, they read the same stuff, but yet they didn't make the solution or the protocol or the process that's effective. So clearly something was overlooked, and I'm grateful that I had a different set of eyes that could see it. and then kind of, make it work for others. And that's really what the purpose is. The average expenditure for people with chronic incontinence for adult diapers or pads is around $200 to $300 per month. So think of it this way: is if you have chronic incontinence, and most people who have it don't have solutions, they're spending between $200 to $300 a month just to manage that symptom. Think of that on a yearly basis, and then think of it as a lifetime basis. That's enormous amounts of money that's just wasted every single day, right? So I guess why I bring that up is because what a huge cost that is to a person's family. What a huge cost that is to, and I don't believe health insurance covers any of those things, but what a huge cost it is to just society in general. All because of that one thing of bladder control. There's options that are available. It's just you have to look outside of the system, because the system's job is to look at a symptom, not so much to look at the big picture.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at the same information, like you were saying, and come up with a totally different solution, right? And that's kind of interesting because we can have different goals and values, I guess. But
Yeah.
just, I don't know. I guess, diabetes, for example, like, they kind of, they admitted it that you can heal it naturally,
Yeah.
ADA. And basically, we've always known that. And the treatment hasn't changed, though. They just kind of said that. But the same, so I don't know. It's kind of interesting,
Well, again, this is kind of a off the topic, and this is what I hope people will understand is healthcare is not healthcare, it's sick care. And sick care is based upon selling pharmaceuticals and selling office visits. So healthy patients don't buy pharmaceuticals, and they don't come into the office very often, if at all, right? So from a business model, it's not very good business model to have healthy patients. So, but as a consumer, you and I are all consumers of healthcare, right? Is we ask the questions of saying, well, this is my greatest asset. Do I want to put in pharmaceuticals? Do I want to have constant office visits to manage the symptom? Now, I understand not all problems can be fully resolved, but many can. So diabetes is a perfect example. Is you can't patent habit modification, right? You can't patent systems that teach people how to take care of themselves. You can patent a chemical reaction, you can patent a chemical combination or recipe, right? And then you can make billions of dollars off of that, but you can't patent things that empower people. And so you can kind of see that the fox might be guarding the hen house here, to use that analogy, is the money's not in healthy people, the money's in sick people. And so that's why I encourage people is, back full circle to our first part of the discussion, is there's no better one to manage your health than you. People like me and others in the health field, they can be guides and coaches and support, because we don't all have all the answers. But taking responsibility is really that first step.
Yeah. And it sounds like the psychosomatic work is 2/3 of the bulletproof bladder
Correct.
program.
Yes. So psychosomatic has gotten a bad rap over the last many years. Is they think, oh, it's in your head, right? You're worried. You're obsessing about being sick, so you're sick all the time. Well, even though that plays a small role, is, in my opinion, the only thing that is rarely addressed is the mental component. Okay, because our thoughts, our beliefs, are stressors that we hold subconsciously. And I like to think of it this way, is you and I are a sum total of every interaction we've ever had. And our subconscious mind is this ongoing record of it. Now, the psychologists or the Freudian people say we got to go into like 47 years of psychoanalysis to figure out every little thing that influenced your subconscious mind. And I don't subscribe to that idea, because who has 47 years and who has the time or money to do that, right? So there's a saying I like to say, it's, the answer to problems isn't in analyzing the darkness or the disease, it's by seeking the light. right? So what does that mean? Well, instead of analyzing why you hold on to all of these different patterns, it's mostly how do we rewrite those patterns? How do we start
Yeah.
looking at things differently? How do we start changing our unconscious stress response? Okay, so part of that is through mindfulness training. So neurosomatic retraining, looking at being aware of things you previously weren't aware of. How do you look at things? Do you look at the world as inherently bad, or do you look at the world as inherently good? Then, no matter where you fall on that spectrum, how do you start looking at it differently? That's part of this awareness component. Well, what's interesting about that, even though it sounds, kind of woo-woo out there to a lot of people, is our subconscious mind is recording these things. So as we start recording new input of, hey, my perspective on the world is skewed towards me having diseases. Let's go ahead and start to look at things differently. How do we do that? Well, we start paying attention. We start doing some mindfulness practicing, okay? And part of my program is to teach people to do that very simply in step-by-step way. I don't like to give it out there names because a lot of people disregard things that are important because they judge it and say, oh my gosh, that sounds like some new age thing. Well, it's not a new age thing. It's just about being conscientious of things you're unconscious to before. And as you start to become conscious, then your overall stress response starts to drop. And that's really what it's about. Okay? So a little off topic is they often say that forgiveness is the key to happiness, right? So, and I'll take that a step further, is holding on to things or holding on to ideas influence us decades after an event happened. So that biblical principle of forgiveness is actually a great health premise. And it gives us insight of saying, the more we hold on to traumas that have had, the more we relive them, and the more our body responds to that event. Because our body doesn't care if it actually happened or if it's just happening from our remembrance. It's still responding in the same way. And that's what our subconscious does. And so that's where many, many diseases come from, is as we start changing our perspectives and looking at things from differently and start letting things go, step by step. Let's start with food. Then let's start with our perspectives, right? As we start letting those things go, then that stress response starts to lighten. And what does that do? Then our healing response starts to percolate to the top and heighten.
I love it, man. I mean, the power of identity is key. I mean, like if you identify with a disease, like this is like who you are a diabetic, it makes it that much more difficult to heal, because what we identify as is basically the actions that we're going to take, right? That's really, really what it is. It's like, to me, it's like keeping the promises that you make to yourself every single day.
Yeah.
Like really embodying the principles that you live by and being the model for others. I think that's really important as well.
And that's a good point, Anthony, because if you identify as part of your personal being as a diabetic, you now have kind of solidified in your mind that you are identified as a diabetic, or fill in the blank. I'm disabled, I'm this, or I'm that, or whatever. As soon as you make that as part of who you are, you've made your subconscious mind part of that. I can't do XYZ because I'm a diabetic. Oh, I have inflammation more because I'm a diabetic. I do this because you see how it really influences all of your other thought processes versus I'm experiencing something, right? My blood sugar's off. My body has trouble managing its blood sugar. How do I address that? How do I bring it right? But when we start making these black and white labels to ourselves, we've really given our subconscious mind the seed that starts to build this whole life around it. It's like an idea, right? And again, that sounds kind of esoteric, but if you reflect back into your life, and this is what I've often told others in the different conversations, they said, hey, what did you learn in medical school? And I learned anatomy and physiology, but I really learned how to become a doctor. And what does that mean? Because from the very beginning, you're being taught this is what a doctor does. This is how they think. This is what they do. This is their ranking in society. You're building an identity over those many years of this is what a doctor looks like. That's what I really learned, The anatomy and
Yeah.
physiology, I could have got all that online or, back when I went in books, right? But it was the identity that was taught to me through all the processes more than it was the facts and the physiology, which is really interesting. And I think others can look into that same idea as you go through these processes so that you can formulate this identity. And then that comes with a whole bunch of other stuff, which is really interesting.
Fascinating, man. Yeah, so this has been awesome. We talked about your amazing story. We've really talked a lot about having agency over your own mind, right? Because we are the source of our healing. And of course, like we use all these external tools. Ultimately, like we have to filter things through our values, our goals. I think we talked a lot of interesting points on that for people to think about. And the Ironclad Bladder System, which is going to be really helpful for people as well in terms of the exercises, understanding stress aspect of it. You went into science of that, so I thank you for that. Um, I really appreciate you so much for coming on and sharing all your insights with us.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I appreciate this opportunity. I hope it helps some
Absolutely.
people.
So, if people want to get connected with you and your work, where can they go for that?
Super easy. They can just go on my website. It's www.drdr, Nigel, Nigel, Brayer, Brayer.com. There's free downloads. There's food changes. There's recipes. There's ways to get in touch with me individually. There's a way to get a hold of the Ironclad Bladder. There's a lot of different stuff. So just check it out. There's podcasts like this one out there that they can listen to on all sorts of different topics. So, yeah.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it so much. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure, Anthony. I appreciate you.
All right.